Welcome to The Debate. This show, presented by Webfit News, focuses on a really critical issue that's come up recently. From changes to New Zealand's electoral law, the Parliament's decision to pass some pretty significant changes to enrolment rules under urgency has, well, it sparked a vigorous national discussion.
It certainly has. It's a discussion about the balance between, on the one hand, administrative efficiency, and on the other, making sure every single eligible person can actually vote.
Exactly. And at the heart of it is this new, earlier deadline for enrollment. The central question we're tackling today is this: does this change primarily serve a legitimate, necessary administrative function, or does it actually create an unacceptable barrier to voter participation? I'll be arguing that these changes are a rational step, one that promotes order and encourages timely civic engagement.
And I'll be arguing that these new rules are a clear case of prioritizing convenience over the core democratic principle of inclusion. And frankly, the way the law was passed, using urgency, well, that just undermined public trust and bypassed essential scrutiny.
Okay, so let me just lay out the rationale here. The move toward earlier deadlines isn't meant to be punitive. It's a rational administrative reform. The stated goal is improving administrative efficiency and reducing pressure on election day processing. For the Electoral Commission, this allows for much better planning, it stabilizes the electoral roll well before the election, and it should, reduce last-minute errors. I mean, think about the sheer scale of the logistics here. When you have firm, early data, the Commission can allocate resources much more effectively, they can finalize polling station locations, manage all the paperwork. The reform is simply asking citizens to fulfill a basic civic duty just a bit earlier. The government has been very clear that the right to vote itself isn't changing. It's the procedure that's been tightened.
So I think we need to move past this overly dramatic language of voter suppression and see it for what it is: sensible system management.
Is that when you prioritize the convenience of the state over the real-world difficulties faced by citizens, that's a fundamental policy failure. The flexibility we had before wasn't some kind of bug in the system. It was a critical democratic safety net. And we have hard data on this. From the last general election, we know that about 20% of voters used that late window to update their enrolment. 20%! That's 1 in every 5 voters. And that's not laziness. It's necessity. It's driven by the complexities of real life. So by restricting this window, you're putting thousands of eligible voters at immediate risk of being excluded just because they moved or their circumstances changed close to the election. And what's more, the impact isn't spread evenly. It's demonstrably disproportionate. We're talking about high mobility groups, young people, renters, recent movers, and it also hits multicultural communities hard. Places where residents might be navigating complex residency statuses or facing language barriers that make dealing with official information that much harder. Taking away this flexibility just adds another barrier for the very people who already find it toughest to stay enrolled.
I see the point, but I have to disagree with that interpretation of the 20% figure. That number, while it is large, isn't proof of a necessary democratic function. I'd argue it's evidence of a chronic inefficiency in the system and, yes, a degree of individual procrastination that the electoral system was being forced to absorb at great cost. I mean, let's just look at the logistics of it. Processing a surge of 20% of your workload in the final couple of weeks, it leads to a massive spike in resource allocation. You have to hire and train temporary staff on the fly, it increases the rate of errors that then have to be fixed after the election, and it just strains public resources. The Electoral Commission's job is to deliver a clean, reliable election result. We can't let individual patterns of, late action dictate a high-risk, inefficient policy for the whole country. This reform simply redirects resources from that chaotic, last-minute processing toward better planning and public education earlier in the cycle.
That completely ignores the structural reasons behind that 20% figure. You mentioned high mobility groups. Okay, think of a student on a 6-month lease or a new migrant family in temporary housing. Their mobility isn't poor planning, it's their economic reality. That late window was a crucial buffer for people whose lives aren't stable. If the goal is a manageable system, you build a system that can cope with modern life. You don't penalize citizens for living it.
To demand that a renter, someone living month to month, maintain perfect up-to-the-minute enrollment accuracy months in advance is it's applying an administrative burden that's completely out of step with their reality.
You're trading what you call administrative neatness for concrete accessibility. If you really want efficiency, the answer is to invest in things like automatic enrollment, not to invent new penalties for the most vulnerable voters. I do see the value in that structural critique. But the argument for automatic enrollment, while it sounds good, it faces huge operational and legal hurdles in New Zealand. That's a whole other legislative battle. The government has to work with the system it has now. And the reality was that the election machinery needed to be stabilized. The old system, where the roll was in constant flux right up until Election Day, it compromised the integrity of things like issuing advance voting papers and even placing polling booths accurately. So this new fixed deadline is a practical step to restore some essential certainty.
Okay, but that brings me to the other major point of contention here, which is the procedure, the way they did this. This wasn't just a minor administrative tweak. This was a change to the fundamental rules of citizen participation. In New Zealand, electoral law is, for all intents and purposes, treated as a constitutional matter. That means it requires broad consensus, it requires deep examination by a select committee, and most importantly, it requires public consultation. And by using urgency, a tool that's meant for genuine national emergencies, the government just bypassed all of that. They shut out the experts, the civil society groups, the everyday citizens who should have had a say. When you change the rules of democracy by administrative fiat, you seriously erode public trust in the whole system.
I understand that line of reasoning, and it's strong on principle, but I don't think it fully grapples with the practical administrative imperative that the government was facing. And look, I agree that urgency should be used with extreme caution for electoral law, but sometimes the timeline dictates the process. The Electoral Commission was clear. To actually operationalize these changes, update their IT, train staff, run awareness campaigns, they needed the law passed well ahead of the next election cycle.
I'm not sure that's a strong enough reason.
Well, if they'd gone through the standard, say, 9-month select committee process, they would have risked not being ready for the next election. That could have led to genuine administrative chaos. So you could see this as a necessary procedural shortcut to prevent a much greater risk to the system itself. The choice wasn't really consultation versus no consultation. It was timely certainty versus a delay that risked operational failure.
I just don't buy that as a defense. Administrative certainty should never, ever come at the expense of democratic legitimacy. If these changes were purely technical, they could have waited. The outcry shows they weren't just tweaks. They had real policy weight. And the practical effect of using urgency is that the government got to dodge a very difficult evidence-based debate about the impact on that 20% of voters. Using urgency sends a signal to the public that the government is afraid of scrutiny. It creates suspicion that the goal wasn't just smooth administration, but maybe something else. A restriction that might benefit one side by discouraging certain groups from voting. That procedural choice has injected political toxicity into what should be a completely neutral part of our governance.
I think we need to be careful not to conflate procedural speed with malicious intent. The government's stated intent was about managing the system. And that brings us to the real impact. Is this suppression, or is it just encouraging better engagement? I find the label voter suppression to be, well, it's rhetorical, and I think it's inaccurate. The government isn't building insurmountable barriers here. They're just setting a deadline that requires responsible civic action. The difference between being a late enroller and being excluded now hinges entirely on an individual's effort to comply with the reasonable deadline. To claim suppression, you'd need to show deliberate mechanisms intended to disenfranchise people. And that's just not what this is. This is about promoting proactive engagement.
I come at it from a different way. Intent doesn't really matter when you're talking about structural barriers. If the effect of a policy is to disproportionately reduce participation among marginalized groups, then the label is justified, or at the very least, you can call it systemic exclusion. You mentioned targeted enrollment campaigns, and yes, they're helpful, but they don't reach everyone, especially people who move a lot or who face language barriers, like in communities in Mount Roscoe. By removing that late window, you are shifting the entire administrative burden onto the citizens least equipped to handle it. So instead of the state investing more in its own capacity to meet the demands of a dynamic society, the state has chosen to streamline its operations by making life harder for the voter. That, functionally, is a systemic hurdle. It results in exclusion for the sake of convenience.
That is a compelling argument about the differential impact, but focusing only on the hardship obscures the alternative, which could be systemic failure due to overload. If the state tries to absorb an ever larger late processing burden without fixed deadlines, the overall quality and security of the election itself is compromised. So the core mandate for any reform has to be a balance. Yes, inclusion, but also a manageable, efficient system that can reliably count the votes without risk.
But the risk remains.
It does, but the Electoral Commission has been very clear that these new deadlines are being paired with much stronger early intervention campaigns. The strategy is to proactively meet those communities where they are, well ahead of the deadline, and pull that engagement forward. This helps mitigate the very risk you're highlighting by addressing the problem earlier instead of waiting for a chaotic last-minute fix.
And I still say the most effective way to address that 20% figure, while maximizing both efficiency and inclusion, isn't to penalize voters. It's to adopt modern technology, like a genuinely automatic, residency-based enrollment system. By choosing this restrictive deadline instead, the government is signaling that accessibility is a secondary concern to administrative ease. And we have to demand a process built on the idea that every eligible vote matters, and that the state should do everything it can to make participation easy, not harder.
Ultimately, I think our debate comes down to the trade-off between two vital principles: the necessity of administrative efficiency for a reliable process and the imperative for maximum inclusion. I still maintain that by fixing the enrollment deadline earlier, these changes serve a vital purpose in ensuring a robust and efficient system for future elections. The system needs predictability, and the focus now has to be on educating the electorate about their responsibility to get their details updated well ahead of time.
And I remain convinced that the cost of this so-called efficiency is being borne by the most vulnerable, jeopardizing the participation of that critical 20% in other high-mobility communities. And given the complete lack of public scrutiny this law received, the debate about prioritizing inclusion over convenience remains absolutely vital for the health of our democracy. The material really shows the tensions that are just inherent in democratic governance, and I believe we must always default to inclusion.
I agree that both of our positions highlight these essential tensions. Whether these changes will successfully foster timely engagement without causing unacceptable levels of exclusion, well, that remains the central question. And the true consequences will only really be clear after the next election, when we see how political parties, community groups, and the Electoral Commission have adapted their strategies.